Privyet, everyone, to another The History Of, in which we'll be talking about the Russian Ushanka hat. But this video is labeled the Broadcloth helmet. True, but in order to really dive into the history of the famous Ushanka hat, we first need to start with the lesser known and somewhat strange Budenovka. So that being said, we got ourselves another two-parter series, so without any further delay, let's get to it. It's November 1917. World War I is nearing its third year. Russian troops are still fighting even with two revolutions at home. The February Revolution that saw Tsar Nicholas abdicate the throne, and the October Revolution, which saw the provisional government be overthrown by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Soon after, the Russian army fell apart and withdrew from the front. From there, Russia would be thrown into a 5-year-long civil war. Though there were many sides, the main two were the Red Army, made up of Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and all of the socialist and communist followers, and the White Army, consisting of various pro-Tsarists, capitalists, and generally any forces who were anti-communist. With all the chaos and turmoil the war brought, many soldiers on both sides found themselves having to scrounge and throw together uniforms made up of everyday clothes, older damaged or leftover uniforms, and even commandeered Imperial Army pieces, which did occasionally cause confusion and, in a few instances, friendly fire. The most common and easiest way the Red Army soldiers identified themselves early on was by simply adding red armbands or articles of clothing. Seeing the state of the Red Army's uniforms, the recently formed RVS, known in English as the Revolutionary Military Council, realized they needed to start equipping their forces with proper uniforms that would differentiate themselves from white troops. And so, in 1918, they began to do just that. However, there are a few different stories as to how this happened. The first one goes like this. When 1918 rolled around, the RVS announced a competition to design standardized uniforms for the Red Army and Navy. From this competition came two significant items: an overcoat similar to the ones worn by streltsy, meaning shooters or musketmen in Russian, and the topic of this video, the peaked caps with ear flaps known as the Budenovka, which was originally called the Bogatirka, meaning hat of the Bogatir. These caps were based on the Kievan Rus helmets, which were worn by the Bogatir, who were essentially powerful, brave, and elite knights referred to in poems, fables, and tales throughout Russia in the 10th century and onward. Much like England had the Knights of the Round Table, Russia had the Bogatirs. Just a side note, a few historians believe that the origin of the hat instead came from the bashlik, which was a coned headpiece worn by Cossacks, but there is not much evidence to support this. These coats and hats were chosen to harken back to the folktales of Russia, to something inspiring and familiar. Now that's one story. The second and more likely story behind the origin of the Budenovka was that while Russia was still fighting in World War I, Tsar Nicholas commissioned the creation of new uniforms. The idea behind the hat and coat were created by famous Russian painters Viktor Vaznetsov and Konstantin Korovin. Vaznetsov was known for his historical paintings as well as revivalist architecture and even working for the imperial government, whereas Korovin did do painting but also worked as a consultant on camouflage for the army, and after the war began designing wardrobes for plays such as the Nutcracker and the Valkyrie. As with the previous story, the idea was to use the coats and hats as a throwback to Russian folklore. By 1917, depots were filled with these new uniforms, ready to be issued, but with the revolutions they remained largely untouched. These uniforms were originally planned to be worn by troops marching in a parade marking Russia's victory in World War I, that many historians speculate was to be held in Berlin. The original versions of these hats were made of khaki lightweight cotton and had cone tops, a front visor, and a single flap that could be rolled down to cover the ears and back of the head, with the front of the hat to bear the Imperial Russian crest. Regardless, the Bogatirka hat started being used sporadically by forces as early as 1918. It briefly gained the nickname Frunzenka after Mikhail Frunze, leader of the Southern Army Group. Frunze and his forces were among the first to wear, as well as create the caps. However, the name didn't quite take hold, and quickly the new and more popular one of Budenovka came to be. This name stuck because by the time the hat became commonplace among Red Army forces, the popular cavalry commander Semyon Budyonny was always seen wearing one. Budyonny helped establish the first Red Army cavalry units and played a major part in the Russian Civil War and Polish-Soviet War, all while wearing the Budenovka. Because of this and his popularity, his signature hat was renamed after him. Now, regardless of the origins and who wore it first and everything like that, by April 1919, the hat, officially called the Broadcloth helmet, became standard issue. First used primarily as a cold weather headpiece, this hat was often made of a dark gray heavy wool and included a stiffener added to the cone top, as previous versions would droop and sag while being worn. However, the most important addition after standardization was that of the unit-specific cloth stars on the front. The most common colors of stars seen were black for engineers, dark blue for cavalry, light blue for Air Force, green for border guards as well as frontier troops, and of course, crimson red for infantry. Shortly after, the addition of a small star pin with a sickle and plow, later replaced by the hammer, was added to the middle of the fabric star. By 1920, these hats had really become widespread and popular among all Soviet forces. This led to many troops creating custom ones, where they would alter the length of the cone top. An expression came from this called umuptvad, or rod brains. Essentially, this was a jab at anyone wearing taller pointed hats, as they were often considered dumber. Though there were summer-style hats, in 1922, an official version was created. Dubbed the M1922, this summer variant was made of cotton, and often seen in light gray, white, and later on a khaki color. Aside from the material and color changes, the only things that differentiated the new summer version from the winter one was a sort of small peak on the back of the hat and the option to remove the neck and ear flap. These gained the nickname Zdravstvuy Proshche, or hello, goodbye, as both sides appeared to be the front. Throughout all of these changes and updates, there were a few exceptions to the colors, based on specific units. For example, members of the Red Guard, and even the personal guards stationed aboard Leon Trotsky's armored train, wore an all-red uniform that included a red leather Budenovka. After the Russian Civil War, the hats remained in service, seeing a few minor changes, the main one being the lowering of the pointed top, which was done to encourage troops to wear it underneath metal helmets. However, come the 1930s, the hat started to fall out of favor, both for political and practical reasons. On the political side, as Stalin took power, the era of the Revolution and Civil War started to be looked upon in a somewhat disreputable way. The hat, being something of a symbol of that bygone era, stopped being produced in 1935, during an era of both military and political reforms. In regards to the practical reasons, the hats were hard to wear underneath helmets, even with the shorter points. This often led many to wear it as an alternative to metal helmets. Additionally, it was soon realized that the hat did not provide all that much protection against the cold. Although the winter version was made of wool, it didn't offer much insulation, as evident by its use during the Winter War with Finland. By the outbreak of World War II, the Budenovka hat was more or less gone, and had been replaced by the garrison-style caps called pilotkas for everyday wear, as well as the ushanka for more cold weather operations. There were, however, a few exceptions, as they were spotted being worn by the occasional Red Army soldier and Soviet partisan. Though the Budenovkas were phased out of the Red Army, they did, however, become popular again in the 1960s in Russia among children. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the streets of Moscow and other popular tourist destinations have been flooded with reproductions of all shapes and sizes. And with that, a chapter in the uniforms of the Russian armed forces has ended. However, another one is about to start, the chapter of the ushanka. Be sure to stay tuned for that second part. And as always, subscribe or come back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.